Masechet Baba Batra Daf Kof Samech Chet. We begin with the story. Hahu Tabra Tavachatim Allah Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba. There was a receipt that had a signature of Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba on it. This is a receipt that a wife gives to the husband, ex-husband, saying that I received my ketubah. So the husband holds on to it so that if she ever comes in the future and says, hey, you have to pay me the ketubah, he produces the receipt that says his name and her name, and it has witnesses signed on it that says that the ketubah was paid up. So there was a receipt like this, and Rav Yirmiyah was one of the two signatures. But now the woman who came before Rav Yirmiyah and says, that's not me on that who's referred to in this receipt. In other words, you have the receipt says Avraham and Sarah, they were married, and this is to certify that Avraham paid the full ketubah to Sarah, and Sarah cannot collect it. But this was referring, there's two Sarahs, the Sarah A and Sarah B. And so the person that was referred to in this document was Sarah A. And then Sarah B, she also happened to get divorced from someone named Avraham. She came to collect her ketubah, and that this Avraham produces a receipt and says, I don't have to pay. Look, I paid already. But she comes and says to Rav Yirmiyah, who signed on it, says, this is not me. There's another Avraham and Sarah. Maybe she paid. I don't know why I never saw this receipt. This is not referring to me. Amad anana me amri lehu lav ihihi. And then Rav Yirmiyah says, you know what? I also had suspicions and said this is not the same Sarah. In other words, Rav Yirmiyah knew Sarah B. He lived down the street from her, he remembered her from growing up, whatever. And when it came time to sign this document, and it said Sarah, when he signed the document, Avraham and Sarah were there in front of him, and they said, hey, come and sign it. And he looked at her and heard her voice, said, and he was suspicious. He said, I don't think this is Sarah. I know Sarah I saw her a few years ago, and this is not her. This is I don't recognize this person. But they assured me that it was the same person. Oh, she got older, her voice matured, and that's why she looks different, she sounds different, but this is really her. But I had suspicions back then when I signed it. And now you're coming and telling me that, in fact, it wasn't you, it was a different Sarah, and so therefore, Rav Yirmiyah is saying that this receipt is invalid. So that was the end of the story. It said, indeed, it is invalid. Now, a comment on that story. Amar Abaye, Afal Gav Da'amur Rabbanan, Kevan Shehigid Shub Eno Chozeru Makid, Survam Rabbanan Lav Urche Lemedak. Abaye said, even though we actually do have a general rule, the rabbis say that once someone states a testimony, they cannot go back on that testimony. That's a general rule. Why? Because if someone comes and says, right, I saw this guy lend money to that one. Okay, good. So you testified about that. Then you come later and you say, oh no, he didn't. It was someone else. So we suspect that what happened? Someone coerced him, told him to take it back. Usually, if someone testifies to something, that means they're telling the truth the first time, and probably maybe they feel bad after, oh, now this is a guy who's going to have to pay, or this person's going to get punished, and now he feels bad, so he says, no, I didn't mean it. So generally, there's a rule that you cannot retract testimony. If we would apply that rule in this case, that would mean that Rav Yirmiyah, when he signed the document, he is testifying that this Sarah that was in front of him and who he thinks is the same Sarah, he is testifying that the Sarah that he has in mind got paid her ketubah. So that is the first testimony. And so normally we would say he cannot retract now and say, oh, it was a different one, right? Even though he had suspicions at first, but in the end he said, okay, I guess it's the same one. And he signed it. So generally we would say that once he signed it, that's it. This is absolute proof and you cannot take it back. However, in this case, when it's talking about a Torah scholar, we let him take it back. You know why? Because it's not a way of a Torah scholar to look carefully and gaze at women. And so he's not looking so carefully, even at the time when he's signing it, to stare at her to see. And therefore, if it's a rabbi and the litigant happens to be a woman, then we assume that he glanced at her, but for the sake of modesty, did not stare, didn't get a good look to be able to recognize after. So therefore, if a rabbi changes his mind and said, oh, I thought it was that person, but I didn't get a good look. Oh yeah, it really is a different person. Then we allow them to change their mind, because they're not changing their mind because they feel bad that the person has to pay or will get punished or is being coerced to change his mind. They're changing their mind because they didn't get a good gaze of the person to see who it was the first time, and therefore they are permitted to change their testimony. Another story about the same rabbi that actually is going to have the opposite conclusion. Another time there was a receipt for a payment of a ketubah, and Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, the same sage, was a signatory on it. Amrale lav ana havai. So the woman comes in, she's trying to collect her ketubah, but then the husband has this receipt, and she says, oh, that's not me. It's another woman with the same name that happens to be married to the same husband. Amarla ibra antava. But Rav Yirmiyah this time says, no, I recognize you. You are the same person. I remember, right? You are exactly the same person, and this is a false claim that you're making now, and you cannot get paid. And this here, Abaye comments, even though generally it's the way of rabbis not to be so careful to look at women, and so therefore, in the previous case, if he changes his mind and says, no, it wasn't her, so then we allow him to withdraw his testimony. But in cases where he is careful, then we know he's careful. And so Rav Yirmiyah, it depends on the case. Rav Yirmiyah, in this case, he happened to know this woman, and he did look at her, and he remembered that exactly what she looked like or what her voice sounded like. And therefore, if he is careful and knows, then for sure he knows. If he says he wasn't sure and he didn't look, then we say he can change his mind. So both are true. And now some good advice Abaye gives to Torah scholars. If they're going to do kiddushin, they should take an ama aretz with them. Why? Because maybe someone will switch the bride. In other words, a Talmid Chacham, he's not going to get a good look at his upcoming bride. Maybe it was a setup, and they barely met each other, or they meet each other for a little bit or one date. Anyway, the Torah scholar is not going to stare at a woman, even if it's the person that he's planning to marry. And therefore, at the time that he gets married, there should be somebody who makes sure that the person that he intends to marry is the one that's actually under the chuppah. Maybe this explains why Yaakov didn't realize that it was the wrong woman under the chuppah. He was modest, and he didn't look so carefully, and he didn't realize it was Leah and not Rachel. Okay, whatever the reason. So the point is, bring in Ama Aretz. Ama Aretz, they are used to looking at women, and so bring in Ama Aretz, bring a friend, and ask the friend, hey, is this the same person I went out on a date with? Because I really wanted to marry her. Can you get a look at her and make sure it's the same person? He says, yeah, that's the same person. And that way, he'll know he's marrying the right woman. Okay, the Mishnah taught that when someone is writing up a get, a divorce document, the husband is responsible for paying the scribe for it. Why? Because the pasuk that talks about divorce says that the man, if he decides that he doesn't like his wife, and he writes a Torah scroll and he gives it, so he's the one that has to write it. If he knows how to write it himself, good. If he doesn't know how to write it himself, then he is responsible for paying to hire a scribe. But nowadays we don't do that. Nowadays we give the woman the responsibility to pay for the scribe. Why did the rabbis give the woman the responsibility? So that he should not delay the divorce. If you more often than not, it's a woman that wants to get divorced, or sometimes it's a woman that wants to get divorced, and then if we make the husband pay for it, he's going to to drag his feet and say, oh, I don't have money right now. I'm getting my check next month. I'll pay for it next month. And then she'll have a delay in receiving her get. And therefore we tell the woman, listen, it's a small expense. Better if the woman just pay for it, and that way the scribe will write it, and therefore the husband won't have an excuse, and she can get her get sooner, and that way she'll be able to go and get remarried or do whatever she wants. And so now we write, the Mishnah mentioned that the scribe can write a loan document for the borrower, even though the lender is not there, and furthermore, the borrower is the one that pays for it. So we say, Peshita, isn't it obvious that the borrower is going to pay for it? He's the one that needs the loan. He's the one that's mostly benefiting from the loan, especially there's no interest. So the lender is actually not benefiting. He gets a mitzvah, but it's the borrower that needs the money. So the borrower, obviously, he should be the one that is responsible to pay the scribe. And the answer is la siricha be'iska. Yes, that is obvious in a simple case. The Mishnah needs to teach us that this is so even when it's a joint venture where the lender is making money. It's not a simple loan, but rather it's a partnership where one person provides the capital and he gives money to the borrower, and the borrower is going to go and invest it, and some of the profits will go to the lender. So in that case, I might have thought that since the lender is making money off of it, that the lender has to go and prepare the documents. And so the Mishnah says, even in that case, it's the borrower that has to pay for the scribe. And the Mishnah said that the scribe can write a document regarding a sale for the seller and give it to the seller, even though the buyer is not there, because it's only going to be effective when the seller gives it to the buyer. But obviously, he can't give it to the buyer, because then if he gives directly to the buyer will say, "Look, it's mine," even if he didn't actually pay for it. All right, and in this case, it's the buyer that has to pay the scribe. We ask, Peshita, isn't it obvious that the buyer has to pay the scribe? He's the one benefiting from having this document. This document is his deed. It's his proof that he in fact bought it. So it's important for him to have the document. It's much less important for the seller to have the document. And the answer is, La siricha b'mocher sadehu mipnei da'ata. No, the Mishnah needs to teach us this so that we know that this is a law even in the case of someone who's selling a field that is of very poor quality. In that case, the seller is more anxious to sell the field than the buyer is to buy it. This is just a sinkhole. It's a money pit. And the seller's like, anyway, just buy it, just get it off my hands, because this owning it is a detriment. So in that case, I might have thought that the seller pays the scribe because he's the one that wants to get rid of the field even more than the buyer wants to buy it. And so this teaches us not so. The buyer always pays the scribe. And kotvin shitre erusin peshita, that who pays for the ketubah and such documents like the agreement that they make before the wedding, the financial agreement before the kiddushin, and the ketubah, which is before the nisuin. The husband has to pay for it. So isn't that obvious? It's the husband that is taking the bride. He's the active party here. So isn't that obvious that he would be the one that would have to pay for the scribe in order to have this done, and in fact, there are some people who have a custom that the groom will give a coin, something, even a small amount, to whoever is writing the ketubah, so that to fulfill this custom. Isn't that obvious? Because he's the one that has to take the woman, so he is initiating the kiddushin and the nisuin. So, isn't that obvious that he has to pay the scribe? La siricha dafilu subam rabbanan. And so the Mishnah teaches this to us to tell us that this is true even if the groom is a Torah scholar, in which case the father-in-law is so happy to bring a Torah scholar into the family. And so you might say that he is the bigger beneficiary of bring a Torah scholar in, and so the bigger beneficiary would generally have to pay the scribe. So I might have thought in that case that the bride's family has to pay the scribe. And then we say not so. Even though it's a great honor for them to have a Torah scholar, nevertheless, it's also a benefit for him that he is getting a wife, and it's really his primary obligation to take her as a wife, and therefore he has to pay. And kotvin shetat arisut v'kablanut v'chule pishita lasiricha bebura. When you're writing a contract for sharecropping, or a contractor, someone owns a field and he's going to give it to a sharecropper to give a certain percentage of whatever grows or a fixed amount of whatever grows. In that case, it's the sharecropper that pays the scribe for writing up the agreement. So isn't that obvious? Because the sharecropper is getting most of the benefit. He gets to work the land and keep a lot of it. So isn't that obvious? And the answer is no. It's necessary for bura, for a fallow field. It's a field. There's some fields that need to stay fallow for a certain amount of time. You have to leave them. You have to let them rest for a year before you can go and plant them. And so it could be that they're writing up this document in the year where the land is going to lie fallow, in which case the sharecropper is not getting any benefit from it. And so you might think in that case that the landowner, he's now getting a guarantee that this land will be worked way in the future, in 2 years. And so you might think that in such a case, the landowner has to pay for it. And now the Mishnah teaches not so. Even in that case, the sharecropper has to pay for the document. En kotvin shitre berurin el mida'at shenehem. Mai shitre berurin. The Mishnah said that arbitration documents have to be written with consent of both parties. Both parties have to know about it. Now, what is it? What is a shitre berurin? Hacha tergimu shitre ta'anata. A document recording the claims. A deposition that they're coming and saying, this is my claims, these are my arguments, these are your arguments. And so because this affects both parties, you can't just write it for one without the knowledge of the other, because you have to give them a chance to counter and say, no, I didn't say that, I didn't do that. And so you can only write these documents when with the permission of both parties. The scribe has to get both parties there to give him permission to write it. Another interpretation of what is a shtar berurin is a document that lists the judges that will be on a case when you have an ad hoc court. This is called zabla ze boreh lo echad. Sometimes you can go to a fixed court, a set court. You go to the office there where the court sits, and you go to the judges. But that would be a regular court. Here we're talking about where if we're having a dispute, so then I pick one judge, whoever I like, and you pick a judge, whoever you like, and then the judges choose a third party. So it's more like arbitration. It's an ad hoc court. If you do such a thing, you have to write it up and say, okay, we both agreed that these will be the 3 judges in our case, and we're giving them the power to do the arbitration. And so if you're writing up such a document, you have to get the permission and agreement of both parties, obviously, because both parties are involved and have to agree to who the judges are. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, Lishnehem kotvin shenayim, lazeh be'asmo ve'lazeh be'asmo. Rashbag says, in these types of documents, however you interpret this, that we make 2 copies, one for one party and another copy for the other party. So Rashbag is disagreeing with Tanakama. Tanakama says you just pay for one copy. They both have to agree to it. But and they'll share the expense, but ultimately they only have to share the expense for one copy, and we'll leave that copy here or there, wherever. One of the parties will hold on to it. If the other party needs to, they can ask for it to see it or to bring it as proof. But Ashbag says you make 2 copies. Now why? Lema bechofin amidat sedom kamipalge. Demor sabar kofin umor sabar en kofin. What's that the essence of their machloket? Maybe they're arguing about the principle of, does the court coerce someone not to act like the way of Sodom? What's the way of Sodom? It's selfish behavior, right? Let's say I have a extra room in my car, and I'm going somewhere anyway. So midat Sodom is, even though it has no loss to me, I'm particular and say, no, I'm not even going to give you this thing, even though it doesn't cost me anything. I don't want you to have it. And so it's to being very stingy. And so maybe that's so you're not supposed to act like Sodom. That's a general rule. The question is, can a court force someone not to act like Sodom? Even though they shouldn't, can we make them not force them or not force them? So Tanakama, who says you only write one copy, says we do force. Even if the other side says, I don't want to pay for it unless I get my own copy. This one maybe also says, I don't want to pay for it unless I get my own copy. Even though you don't really need 2 copies, it's enough to have 1 copy, but they're being stingy and they're saying, I'm only going to pay for it. So Tanakama says, we force them to not be stingy. Stop being stingy and just share the cost with someone else for 1 copy. That's all you need. And therefore, Tanakama says just 1 copy. Whereas Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, we do not force someone not to be stingy. We hope that they won't be stingy. We try to convince them. But ultimately, if they say, I want my own, then they'll pay, and this one will get their own, and the other one will also get their own copy. So that's why Rashbag says here, if they demand it, then they each will write their own copy. So is that what they're arguing about? And we say no, not necessarily. La. Maybe in fact everybody agrees that you can force someone not to be stingy, and we'll tell them, and we would tell them if it was just because of that, no, you pay half and you pay half, and stop being stingy and saying that you only pay for it if you get the whole thing, right? So no, you have to pay just for half, and we're only writing 1. We're not going to waste money because of your stinginess. That everybody would agree to that in principle. However, Shimon ben Gamliel, Rashbag disagrees and says you write 2 copies, not because we force someone not to be stingy, but rather for a different reason. But rather, either party has a legitimate claim if they say, I don't want my merits to be together with your merits. In other words, this whatever it says in this document about my defense, if it's depositions, and that would be claims of defense, or if it's arbitration, this would be the statement of who my judge is and who your judge is. Says, I don't want the things that I need in the document that will defend my position. I don't want them to be all in one document together with yours. And then what's going to happen? If you hold on to it, every time I need to come and consult it, then you're going to give me a hard time. Or if I'm holding it, you're going to keep coming over and giving me a hard time, right? Because you know what? You are like a lion that ambushes me. And I don't trust you with anything, and I don't want to deal with you. And so therefore, I want 2 copies. You'll have a copy. I'll have a copy. And that way, I won't have to deal with your ambushing. And so that is legitimate. If someone says, I want my own copy because of that's the reasoning of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Next Mishnah, מי שפרע מקצת חובו והשליש את שטרו ואמר לו, אם לא נתתי לך מכאן ועד יום פלוני, תן לו שטרו. Someone pays back a part of his debt. Let's say he owes $1,000 and he just paid back $500. He's intending to pay the other $500 soon. Now, what should happen with the loan document? We're not going to let the lender hold on to the loan document, because then he'll come and try to collect $1,000 all over again and won't have record of the $500. If he gives it back to the borrower, then the lender won't have proof that he's still owed another $500. And so they agree that they're going to give it to a third party to hold on to it until such time as the rest of it is paid. And if the borrower then pays the rest of it in a timely manner before a certain deadline, in that case, the third party will give the document to the borrower, and the borrower can rip it up. And then that's it. The loan will be done. However, the borrower says, listen, I want to guarantee to you that I'm going to pay by 1 month from now. And so I'm telling you as right now, if I don't pay you the remaining balance of $500 from now until 1 month from now, then I'm telling the third party he can give the document back to you. In which case you'll be able to collect the entire amount all over again. Basically, he's agreeing to a 100% fine if he doesn't pay by that certain date. Now, who would agree to this? It means that he's so sure that he's going to be able to pay beforehand. He's like, you can take back the loan and collect the $500 again if I don't pay by this date next month. Okay, now let's say it happens that Higia Zaman Velo Natan. Sure enough, that deadline comes and he doesn't pay. He thought he was getting money in. He didn't have the money. Now what? Rabbi Yosef Omer yiten. Rabbi Yehuda Omer lo yiten. Rabbi Yosef says that third party should in fact give the loan document back to the lender, and the lender will be able to collect a whole 1,000 again, because that was the agreement. That's what he said. And so, yes, that's what he does. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, he doesn't give it back. The third party does not give it. He'll hold on to it, and he'll still have to pay the 500, but he doesn't give it back to the lender. So let's try to understand this machloket. B'mai kami palge. Rabbi Yosef sabar asmachta kanya. Rabbi Yehuda sabar asmachta la kanya. What's the essence of their machloket? Whether asmachta. Asmachta means a transaction that one makes that is kind of like a bet that you don't really expect that is going to be a problem. And so when, say, if like someone said, if it rains tomorrow, I'll give you $1 million because I'm so sure it's not going to rain. Or this person that's approaching, I think that is not Bob. I'll give you $1 million if it is Bob. You only say it because you're so sure, but you don't really have in mind that you're actually going to pay that amount, right? You're just kind of saying it as a expression. I'm so sure of what I'm about to say, but I didn't have in mind that I'm actually going to pay it. So if you have a case of an asmachta, kind of like a wild bet, is that valid? Rabbi Yosef says it is valid. If you said it, then you have to pay it. And even though this guy, he fully expected he was going to pay the other $500 beforehand, and he said, if I don't pay you, I'll pay you double, and you can get the document back. Even though it's an asmachta, it's valid, and therefore the third party gives the document back to the lender. Rabbi Yosef, however, says, sabar asmachta la kanya. When someone says a statement like that, they don't really mean that they're ever going to pay. So they never actually agreed to it. And therefore, even though he said it, we do not make him pay. We do not give the document back to the lender so that the borrower does not have to pay the whole $1,000. Amarav Nachman, Amar Abba Bar Avu, Amarav halacha Rabbi Yosef. So Rav in Bavel decided the halacha like Rabbi Yosef that asmachta kanya, and he's going to have to pay the whole $1,000, and the document goes back to the lender. Ki atu lekamed Rabbi Ameh, Amar lehu v'chi me'achas Rabbi Yochanan melamedenu pa'am rishona u'shniya halacha Rabbi Yosef ani ma'ani yaseh. As another case came to Rabbi Ameh, and it was the borrower saying, "Oh, please help me out. I can't pay another $500. I already paid $500. I'll pay the other $500, but I can't pay a whole $1,000 now and pay this big penalty. Can't you help me out?" And Rabbi Ameh says, what can I do? Rabbi Yochanan, the greatest Amora in Eretz Yisrael, he taught us not once, but twice, and maybe more. He taught us repeatedly that halacha is like Rabbi Yosef, asmachta kanya. So what can I do? Sorry, the loan document goes back to the lender, and you're going to have to pay the fine. Ve'en halacha ke Rabbi Yosef. However, the bottom line is, quite amazingly, even though we just saw Rav, the greatest Amora in Bavel, and the greatest Amora in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yochanan, they both said halacha as asmachtan kanya, but in the end, the Gemara says halacha is not so. Next Mishnah, Misha nimchak shetar chobo ma'amid alev aidim ubad lifnei beit din v'osin lo kiyum ish peloni ben peloni nimchak shetaro beyom peloni ufloni edav. Let's say someone has a document, let's say a loan document, and it got erased. The signatures got erased. So now this is a problem. This guy has a loan document. He says you owe me $1,000, but maybe it's a few years, and he looks back and he sees that the signatures aren't there, and so now how is he going to collect his loan? Does he lose out on all his money? No, there is a solution. He can go and get witnesses that remember that the loan, they were there at that time. And he brings them to Bet Din, and the Bet Din will ratify the document. They'll talk to the witnesses and verify that, yes, in fact, what it says in the document is true. So therefore, even though there's no witnesses on the document because they got erased, but we have witnesses right here that are verifying that the contents of the document are true. And then the Bet Din will write, this person, the son of that person, he has a document, but the witnesses were erased. And this actually, there was a loan on this date, and this was the amount, and so on. And this person and that person are the witnesses that came to us, and they remembered it. And therefore, you have a ratification of the document, and that will be a replacement for the erased document. And that way, he will be able to collect his loan. Tenorabanan, ezehu kiyumo. A baraita expands on the Mishnah regarding the language of this document of ratification. And it says, B'motav tilatavena anu piloni ufloni ufloni. First of all, it has to say that we were in a session of the Bet Din, and it was Judge A, Judge B, Judge C. They put their names. Hosi piloni ben piloni shtar machuk lefanenu biyom piloni. And they say this person, he produced a document that was erased, and we could barely read it, and the witnesses aren't there, and so ufloni ufloni ayadav, and this and that person are the witnesses that came and they testified about the contents that was in that document, and now we have new witnesses to it, and we are ratifying it. Im katubo huzkaknu la'adutan shel adim v'nimset adutan mechuvenet gobe v'no sarich la'avir ra'aya v'im lav sarich la'avir ra'aya. Now, if it says also in the ratification that we looked into it, we looked into their testimony, we checked it out, and it turns out that these two witnesses, their different testimonies were corroborated. They would take the witnesses and separate them and ask them many questions, and then make sure that what the witness A and what witness B say corroborate with each other. If there's any contradictions, then that's a red flag, and it means that they seem to be lying. And so if this says that we checked out the witnesses and it turns out that it's congruent, they're corroborated, and it says that in the ratification, then the lender can collect without bringing any further proof. That's it. That's the proof. However, if it doesn't say that, then the lender is going to still have to bring proof, because in that case, the ratification is just that, right? There were witnesses that came and said, so they put this in, but they didn't check out those witnesses. So in that case, it will need further ratification when he wants to come to collect. Now, Nikra Pasul, the Baraita continues and says, if the document is torn, then it's invalid. Nitkareya kasher. But if it became torn accidentally, then it's okay. So if it was torn on purpose, then it's no good, because that's what you do with an old document. Once it gets paid, then the Bet Din or the borrower tears it up, and now it can't be used anymore. But if you can see that it was torn by mistake, then it's still valid. Nimchak o nitashtesh im rishomo nikar kasher. If it was erased or smudged, but you can still see it, even if it's smudged or somewhat erased, you hold it up to the light, look carefully, and if you can still see the writing that was there, then that's valid, even if it's not nice and bold. Now that's the end of the Baraita. The Gemara is going to ask, what does it mean if it's torn or if it was torn on purpose versus was torn by mistake? How do you tell the difference? Amar Rav Yehuda nikra kera shel betin, nitkareya kera she'eno shel betin. Rav Yehuda says torn means a tear that's done by the Bet Din. The Bet Din has a special way of tearing things to make it totally invalid. So we'll see what that is. Whereas it was torn, it's just going to be a random tear. You just you happen to pass by something and it caught onto a hook and it got torn. So then it's not going to be a special tear the way the Bet Din does it. How does a Bet Din tear up a document when they decide that it's no longer usable? Amar Rav Yehuda mekom adim or mekom hazaman or mekom hatoref. Abaye amar sheti va'erev. So Rav Yehuda says they make sure to tear where the witnesses are, where the date is, and the place. Those the place of the essential part of the document, the toref that has the main part. It's kind of like when you're tearing apart a check. You want to make sure to tear where the signature is and where the amount is. Right? You want to tear the key parts so that no one will be able to. If you just tear like a corner or a margin, then someone might be able to take a part of it that remains and still use it for something, because if it has a full signature and a number and so on, then you might be usable. So the Bet Din knows that they tear the key parts of it so that it can't be used. If it's torn in that way, then you can be sure it was torn on purpose. It is invalid. But if it's just a random tear at a not important place, then that just means it was torn by mistake and it is still valid. Abaye says the way the Bet Din does it is lengthwise and widthwise. If it's just torn in one direction, then that's just a mistaken tear. But if it's torn horizontally and vertically, then it was torn on purpose. Next, we have an interesting story. Hanhu araba'e da'atu lepumpedita davu ka'anse ar'ata de innashe. There were some Arabs that came to Pumpedita, and they were robbing people and forcing them to hand over their deeds. And so they're basically robbing the land because now this Arab has the deed. Remember, this is before Islam was created, so this has nothing to do with Islam. This is just Arab marauders that came through and were stealing people's land. Atu marvataihu lekame de Abaye. Amru le lichazi mor shetarin v'lichtov lan mor shetara charina ale. Di mitnis had nikitinan had beyadan. And so the owners of the land came to Abaye and said, Abaye, look, this is a big problem. They're coming and they're taking our deeds. Can you do us a favor? Look at our deeds and make another copy for it. We want a backup copy for our deed so that if they come and rob us and steal our deed, then we have another one as a backup, and then we can bring it to the court and we'll be able to prove that really this land is ours. Amar lehu, my abid lehu, Amar Rav Safra, en kotvin shetesh shetarot al sadeh achat, dilma tarif v'hadar tarif. And Abaye says, sorry, I cannot help you, because Rav Safra, his name happens to mean scribe, Rav Safra gave a ruling, and he said, you cannot write two deeds for one piece of land. Why not? Because if the land gets repossessed, then the buyer will be able to get paid back twice, as follows. When someone sells a land, generally they sell it with a guarantee. And the guarantee says, listen, I'm selling you this land for $1 million. Good. The buyer gives $1 million to the seller. Now, that land might have a lien on it, right? But the seller, he owed someone money. So the guarantee says, listen, if this land gets repossessed by someone who owns that lien, then there's a guarantee you can get your money back, and you can do that. So how do you get the money back? If you're a buyer and you have the deed, then you come to court and say, listen, I'm the buyer, I have a deed, look, I paid $1 million, but the land got repossessed. Therefore, the seller has to give me $1 million. Fine, so you bring it to court, the seller gives you $1 million. If you have two deeds, then the buyer could, illegally, but he could go and take the second deed and say, oh, look, I have a deed. It says a guarantee that if the land is taken away, he owes me $1 million. And now the seller can come and say, I already paid you $1 million. No, what do you mean? I have the deed. See, you never paid me. The deed is actually proof that he is owed the money. And so if there's two deeds, then he'll be able to collect that $1 million twice. And therefore, you cannot write two deeds. So he says, sorry, I cannot help you. Havu katardile. But the landowners kept badgering Abaye. Said, no, you got to help us. Write us something. Come on, you got to do this for us. Amar le lesafrezil ketob lehu hu ala mechak v'haidav ala niyar de pasul. And so Abaye, he just wanted to get these landowners off his back because they were badgering him. So he told his scribe to write a document in a way that it was not valid. These landowners don't know the details of halacha, so they'll think, okay, we have a backup copy, but in fact, they'll never be able to use it in a false way to collect money twice in the case that of a guaranteed land that with a lien that was taken over. So how do you write it in such a way that it will be invalid? He told his scribes, go and take a piece of parchment and write something on it and then erase it. And write the text of the document on the erased part. Up on the top half, write something, erase it, and then write on the erased part. But the witnesses, they should write on the regular part that has not been erased, on the pristine part of the parchment. And we learned above Abaraita that if you do that, so if you write the whole thing on erased parchment, that's okay. But if the text is on erased and the witnesses are on a part that's not erased, that's invalid. The other way around would be okay, but not this way. So that's what he did. Amar le Rav Acha bar Yomi le Abaye v'dilma rishumo nikar. And so after that story, Rav Acha bar Yomi asks Abaye told the scribe to do that. So now he has a challenge to Abaye. Hold on, we learned just now in this Baraita that if you can still read the document that has been erased, then it's valid. And now this is a problem, right? V'tanya nimchak o nitashtesh im rishmo nikar kasher. That's the Baraita that we just saw. If it's erased or smudged, but you can still read it, then it's valid. In these pieces of parchment, it was very hard to erase it totally. You can scrape away the ink and scrape away a layer, but if the ink gets absorbed, then if you look carefully, usually you can still see, even until today, when we find these documents that were erased, you can generally see the writing that was underneath. Sometimes you can actually see it better now than you could have 1,000 years ago because the ink comes up over time. Okay, in any case, they said this is a problem because if the scribes do this, they're going to write some document, maybe this very document that says the contents of the deed or some whatever they're going to write on it. So let's say they write the contents of the deed. They erase it, and then they write it again. And now the writing is on an erased part, but the witnesses are on a pristine part. It will be invalid. But here's the problem. Rav Acha bar Yomi is asking, if you can read the original words that are before the erasure, well, then that's valid. And now you're actually giving them a valid document. If it has the text of the deed on it, that's a second deed. Or some other text, you wrote a loan document on it. Now you're writing a false loan document that they can use for something. So how can you allow that? And his answer is, Abaye says, did you think that I was telling them that they should write an actual proper document underneath, one that's usable? I didn't mean that. I meant that the scribe should just write Aleph Bet. Just write the alphabet, write nonsense letters, give it to the kid to practice their handwriting, write Aleph Bet. Erase that. Well, it doesn't matter what's written in it. And so erase just nonsense letters. And now it's an erasure. On top of that, write a deed and then sign on the pristine part. And then that case is no problem. Even if you could read what was written underneath, there's nothing significant written there. And the document as is has the document on an erased part and the witnesses on a pristine part, and that's invalid. Give it to them, and then the landowners, they thought they had a backup copy. In fact, if these Arab marauders came and would steal the document, actually they have a good use for it. Maybe the landowners, if they figured this out, they could give the marauders the fake document, and then they would go away and they would keep the real document. But either way, he helped them out maybe with or without them realizing, by giving them a false document that they could not use to fraudulently collect twice if the land would be repossessed. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.